You probably think of it as an Apple product, designed in California. That's what it says on the back. But the magnets inside it, the ones that make the speakers work, that make the camera focus, that make it vibrate when you get a message, those depend on a material most people have never heard of. And one country controls roughly 90% of how that material gets processed. 90%. Most people couldn't name it if you paid them. But without it, this phone doesn't work. Your car doesn't start. No wind turbine spins. No missile launches. And I'm not talking about oil. I'm not talking about gold. I'm talking about something so obscure that if you Googled it right now, you'd probably misspell it. At that point, it stops sounding like market share and starts sounding like everyone else made a terrible life choice. So I started with the obvious question. What even are rare earths? The name makes them sound incredibly rare, which, to be fair, is great branding if your goal is to confuse people immediately. But here's the weird part. They're not actually rare in the Earth's crust. They're just hard to find in concentrations worth extracting, and even harder to separate into a form you can actually use. There are 17 of these elements, names like neodymium, dysprosium, yttrium. A week ago, I couldn't have named a single one, which is slightly embarrassing considering I'm literally holding a device that needs them to function. Because they're in this: the vibration motor, the speakers, the camera autofocus. Every time your phone buzzes, that's rare earths. And then I started looking at the scale. The global rare earth market is worth somewhere around $5 billion a year. $5 billion. I looked at that number 3 times. Apple makes that in about 2 weeks. NVIDIA makes that in a bad quarter. $5 billion. That's the entire market for the materials that make phones work, EVs move, missiles launch, and wind turbines spin. Industries worth trillions, completely dependent on a supply chain worth less than what Netflix spent on content last year. That's a $5 padlock on a $5 million house. And one country has the key. Rare earths aren't rare in the ground. They're rare in a usable form, and those are 2 very different problems. So if these materials matter this much, how did one country end up controlling almost all of the processing? And here's what surprised me. This wasn't some dramatic secret takeover. It happened slowly, quietly, in full view of everyone, which is almost more impressive. In the 1980s and 1990s, the West was moving away from dirty, heavy industry. Nobody wants toxic waste, radioactive byproducts, acid lakes. So the global strategy was basically, we'd love the magnets. We'd just prefer that somebody else deal with the acid. China said, sure, we'll take that. And for a while, it looked like the West got the better end. We got clean economies, service sectors, tech booms. China got solvents. Except that's not what happened. Because processing isn't just a step in the chain. It is the chain. Without it, the raw material is useless. You can own every mine on Earth and still need to ask China to turn the rocks into something you can actually put in a phone. There's a line from Deng Xiaoping, said it decades ago. The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. At the time, that probably sounded like a slogan. Now it sounds like a memo nobody else read carefully enough. Because today, China mines roughly 60 to 70% of rare earths. But that's not the number that got me. In processing, the share is close to 90%. 9 out of 10 facilities that turn these rocks into something your phone can use are in one country. The West didn't lose this advantage. It gave it away, voluntarily, and called it efficiency. That's like selling someone the weapon because you thought it was too heavy to carry. Now, I want to stop here for a second, because everything I've said so far might still sound theoretical. Control, leverage, bottleneck. Big words, conference words, the kind of words people nod at during panels and then immediately forget over coffee. So let me show you what it actually looks like when someone uses this kind of power. China gets into a territorial dispute with Japan over a group of islands. And during that dispute, China restricts rare earth exports to Japan. Prices didn't just go up a little, they spiked. In some cases, around 10 times higher. Within months, 10 times. Imagine filling up your car for $50 on Monday. By Thursday, the same tank costs $500. That is not a market fluctuation. That is the supply chain equivalent of somebody casually pulling the fire alarm in a building with no exits. And then, and this is the part that genuinely unsettled me, China relaxed the restrictions, not because it lost, not because someone forced it. It just stopped, like it was making a point. And I think that's almost scarier, because it wasn't a crisis. It was a demonstration. Look what we can do. Now let's go back to normal. And everybody got the message. Nobody says it out loud, but since 2010, everyone in this industry knows the rules. And the pattern didn't stop there. China has also restricted exports of gallium and germanium. Same logic, same message. And this is where something clicked for me that I honestly can't unthink. We like to think we live in a digital world. Decentralized, free, independent. Nobody owns the internet. Nobody controls technology. But that's a story we tell ourselves, because everything digital sits on top of something physical. And that physical layer has an owner. In 2019, the United States tried to destroy Huawei, cut off their access to American chips, banned Google services, basically tried to use the technology supply chain as a weapon. And the message was clear: we control the supply chain. Except they don't. Not the one that matters most. China controls a different supply chain, the one underneath, the physical one, the one without which there is no iPhone. And here's the irony I keep coming back to. Huawei came back, built its own chips, built its own operating system. Meanwhile, the iPhone, the single most iconic product of American tech dominance, still depends on materials that China processes. So if America's biggest play was cutting off Huawei and it didn't work, what's plan B? Because the US tried to use supply chains as leverage against China, and China is sitting on the supply chain below that one. That's like banning someone from your house while they own the ground it's built on. And that's when I realized this isn't a flaw in the system. This is the system. We built the future on foundations we don't control, and we did it on purpose. So is anyone doing anything about it? The EU passed the Critical Raw Materials Act. The US is investing through companies like MP Materials. Japan has been working on recycling and diversification since 2010. So I looked at all three and thought, we're moving. Progress is being made. And then I looked at the timeline, and that's where the optimism stopped. A processing plant takes close to a decade to build. Permits alone can take years. Financing, engineering, environmental pushback. Because, funny enough, nobody in the West wants a rare earth processing plant in their backyard now either. Same problem, 30 years later. Same answer, not here, please. If COVID taught us anything, it's that supply chains break. We just didn't expect them to be breakable on purpose. China's lead isn't 5 years, it's 30. And 30-year leads are not exactly the kind of thing you catch up on with optimism and a PowerPoint. Here's what I keep coming back to. We talk about the digital economy like it's weightless, like it's just code, just software, just intelligence floating in the cloud. But code runs on hardware. Hardware runs on materials, and those materials pass through a bottleneck controlled by one country. The future sounds digital, but underneath, it's physical, concentrated, and political. And that's the part nobody puts in the keynote. So next time you pick this up, just remember, this isn't really an Apple product. It's a product of a supply chain that one country controls, and everyone else hopes will keep working. If everyone knows about this dependency, and they do, why is nobody acting like it's urgent? Either the risk is overstated, or we're all just hoping it works out. Which one do you think it is? Drop it in the comments. And if you say just build more mines, explain where.